There are moments in life that expose who people truly are. Mine came through a single text message that arrived while my grandmother fought for her final breath in a hospital intensive care unit. I begged my parents to come before it was too late, hoping that for once they would choose family over themselves. Instead, they chose comfort, luxury, and convenience. They had no idea that one selfish decision would destroy the image they had spent decades carefully building. They also had no idea that my grandmother had one final lesson waiting for them, and I was the person she trusted to deliver it. My name is Claire, and I am 35 years old. Looking back now, I realize I spent most of my childhood trying to understand why love came so easily from one person and felt completely impossible from two others. My parents, Richard and Vanessa, were experts at looking kind whenever someone else was watching. Friends admired them, neighbors complimented them, and distant relatives believed they had built the perfect family behind closed doors. Though everything was different, every conversation became a competition, every favor came with conditions, and every relationship was measured by what it could give them in return. I grew up believing something was wrong with me because I never felt like enough. The one person who changed that belief was my grandmother, Evelyn. She never tried to impress anyone or prove how generous she was. She simply loved people without expecting payment. Whenever my parents ignored me because they were chasing another vacation, another business opportunity, or another chance to impress strangers, Grandma quietly filled the empty spaces they left behind. She attended my school events, baked my favorite desserts, stayed awake with me whenever I was sick, and reminded me that kindness did not make someone weak. She became the steady foundation beneath my feet when everything else around me felt uncertain. As I grew older, the distance between my parents and Grandma became impossible to ignore. They visited only when birthdays, holidays, or money were involved. Every phone call sounded rushed. Every visit ended with questions about investments, property values, or legal paperwork instead of genuine concern for her health. Grandma never complained in front of them. She simply smiled, changed the subject, and waited until they left before admitting how lonely she had become. Even then she defended them, saying people sometimes lost themselves while chasing the wrong dreams. I wanted to believe her, but each passing year made that harder. Despite everything, I stayed close to Grandma. We spoke almost every day, shared meals every weekend, and created little traditions that belonged only to us. Saturday mornings were spent tending her flower garden. Sunday afternoons usually ended with coffee at the kitchen table while she told stories about growing up with almost nothing but still feeling richer than many people with expensive houses. Those conversations shaped the woman I eventually became. She taught me that character mattered far more than appearance, and loyalty revealed itself during the hardest moments rather than the happiest ones. Everything changed on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was finishing paperwork at work when my phone rang several times in a row. I almost ignored it because I was in the middle of an important meeting, but something inside me felt uneasy. When I stepped into the hallway and answered, I heard a frightened neighbor explaining that Grandma had suddenly collapsed at home. An ambulance had already taken her to the hospital, and doctors believed she needed emergency surgery immediately. My heart felt like it had stopped. I grabbed my keys, left everything behind, and drove faster than I ever had before while praying I would not arrive too late. The hospital felt painfully cold the moment I walked inside. Bright white lights reflected off polished floors while nurses hurried through endless hallways. Machines beeped from every direction, creating a rhythm that somehow made everything feel even more frightening. A surgeon met me outside the operating room after what felt like endless waiting. His tired expression told me the truth before he even spoke. The operation had prevented immediate disaster, but the damage to her body was extensive. He gently explained that she was alive, yet her condition remained extremely critical. If I wanted family members to say goodbye, they needed to come as quickly as possible, because she probably had only a few hours left. My hands shook so badly that I almost dropped my phone. I called my father first because I still believed a son would never ignore news like this. The call rang until voicemail answered. I tried again with the same result. I called my mother next, but she declined the call before it even finished ringing. Refusing to give up, I opened a group message and typed as quickly as my trembling fingers would allow. I told them Grandma was dying, the doctors expected the worst, and they needed to get to the hospital immediately. I stared at my phone, hoping every passing second would bring the response I desperately wanted. Several long minutes passed before my screen finally lit up. Relief lasted only a heartbeat. The message came from my father, and every word felt colder than the hospital room around me. He wrote that I was already there, so Grandma was in good hands. Then he added that they would come if she actually died, because there was nothing they could do before then anyway. I read the message over and over, unable to believe anyone could respond that way to their own mother. Tears blurred the screen until I could barely see the words anymore. My chest felt painfully tight as I realized they had chosen not to say goodbye. I later learned they had already boarded a luxury cruise that morning. Canceling the trip would have cost them money, and apparently that mattered more than spending a few final moments with the woman who had devoted her entire life to raising my father. That realization broke something inside me. I had spent years making excuses for their selfishness, convincing myself they simply struggled to express emotion. In that instant, every excuse disappeared. There was no misunderstanding, no complicated explanation, and no hidden reason. They simply valued their own comfort more than the person lying alone in intensive care. I slipped my phone into my pocket and quietly entered Grandma's room. The steady rhythm of medical equipment echoed through the space while soft afternoon sunlight filtered between partially closed blinds. She looked unbelievably small beneath the blankets, and the strength I had always admired seemed to have faded from her fragile body. Even so, when I gently wrapped my fingers around her hand, she squeezed back with surprising determination. A few seconds later her eyes slowly opened. They looked tired, but they were still filled with the same warmth that had comforted me since childhood. She studied my face carefully before speaking. Even without asking, she could tell something was terribly wrong. After a moment she whispered the question I had been dreading. She asked whether Richard was coming. My throat tightened so badly that speaking felt impossible. I wanted to protect her from one last disappointment, but lying to her during her final hours felt even crueler. I slowly removed my phone from my pocket, opened the message, and placed it where she could read every word herself. She stared at the screen for several silent seconds. I watched closely, expecting heartbreak or anger, but neither appeared. Instead, she closed her eyes for a brief moment and released a quiet sigh that sounded more like acceptance than surprise. When she looked back at me, there was sadness in her expression, yet there was also peace. She softly admitted that she had hoped he might finally prove her wrong before the end. Instead, he had simply confirmed everything she already knew. I apologized through tears even though none of it was my fault. Grandma gently squeezed my hand and asked me not to waste another second blaming myself for choices other people had made. She reminded me that kindness could never force someone else to become compassionate. People revealed their true character when life presented difficult decisions, and my parents had revealed theirs completely. Hearing her speak so calmly somehow hurt even more because I realized she had carried this disappointment silently for many years. After resting for several minutes, Grandma suddenly looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Her tired eyes became focused and determined. She told me she needed my help with one final responsibility before she left this world. Her voice remained weak, but every sentence carried absolute certainty. She explained that some truths needed to survive beyond her lifetime, because silence would only reward people who had spent years hiding behind carefully crafted lies. She slowly pointed toward my phone and asked if it could record video. When I nodded, she asked me to place it on the bedside table where the camera could clearly see her face. My hands trembled as I adjusted the angle exactly the way she wanted. Something deep inside me said this moment would change everything, even though I still had no idea what she planned to say. After taking one slow breath, I pressed the record button and stepped quietly beside the bed. Grandma looked directly into the camera with remarkable strength. The weakness in her body seemed to disappear as she began speaking. She introduced herself calmly before explaining that if anyone ever watched the recording, it meant she was no longer alive. Then she spoke about family, honesty, and the painful difference between sharing blood and sharing love. Every sentence felt carefully chosen, as though she had spent years preparing words she never expected to say aloud. Listening to her, I realized she was not speaking from anger, she was speaking from truth. She described decades of emotional neglect that almost nobody outside our family had ever witnessed. She explained how appearances had protected people who cared more about money than relationships and how kindness had often been mistaken for weakness. Then she held up my phone and showed the message my father had sent only minutes earlier. Her voice never rose with rage. Instead, it remained calm and heartbreakingly clear as she explained that no parent should abandon their own mother during her final hours because a vacation seemed more important. When she finished speaking, she asked me to stop recording but requested one more favor. She reached toward the drawer beside her hospital bed and removed a small flash drive that had been sitting inside an envelope. She placed it gently into my hand before closing my fingers around it. She told me the recording would eventually be copied onto that drive along with several important documents prepared by her attorney. Then she looked directly into my eyes and made me promise that I would never play the recording alone for my parents. Everyone needed to hear it together because truth deserved witnesses. I promised without hesitation. She smiled with quiet relief, leaned back against her pillow, and whispered that she finally felt ready to rest. For the next several hours I stayed beside her bed, talking softly about memories from my childhood, the flowers waiting in her garden, and all the little moments that had made my life brighter because of her. She listened peacefully while holding my hand the entire time. Just before sunrise, her breathing gradually slowed until it became completely still. She slipped away with dignity, surrounded not by the family she deserved, but by the granddaughter she had spent a lifetime teaching how to love. 1 week later, the morning of her funeral arrived, and as I stood outside the chapel holding the small flash drive inside my pocket, I realized my parents still had no idea what Grandma had left behind. They believed they were arriving to collect sympathy, protect their reputation, and eventually claim everything she had worked for. They smiled politely as they greeted relatives who knew nothing about the message they had ignored. Watching them perform their roles so confidently, I silently remembered the promise I had made beside Grandma's hospital bed. Before the day ended, every carefully hidden truth would finally stand in the light. I stood near the front of the chapel while relatives slowly filled the rows behind me. Soft music echoed through the room, and people spoke in quiet voices about the wonderful woman they had come to honor. Then my parents arrived. Richard stepped through the doors wearing an expensive black suit that looked like it had never been worn before, while Vanessa followed beside him carrying a lace handkerchief she kept pressing against perfectly dry eyes. They moved through the crowd with dramatic expressions, accepting hugs, shaking hands, and thanking everyone for their sympathy. Anyone seeing them for the first time would have believed they had lost the most important person in their lives. I knew the truth, and that performance made me feel sick. Several neighbors walked over to me and quietly shared stories about Grandma. They remembered how she always checked on elderly people living alone, baked pies for families going through hard times, and never forgot a birthday. As they spoke, I caught my parents smiling sadly and pretending to wipe away tears whenever someone looked in their direction. The contrast was almost unbearable. Genuine grief surrounded one side of the room, while calculated acting filled the other. I stayed silent, because I knew the time for truth had not arrived yet. After the first part of the service ended, people stepped outside into the garden for fresh air before the final farewell. I remained inside, needing a few quiet moments to myself. That was when Richard approached me. The sorrow disappeared from his face the instant nobody else was close enough to hear us. His expression became sharp and impatient as he leaned closer. He did not ask how I was coping or whether I had been sleeping. Instead, he immediately asked where Grandma's legal papers were. He wanted to know if I had already spoken with her attorney and whether the house, savings, and investment accounts had been transferred into his name. For a few seconds I simply stared at him. My grandmother had been gone for only a week, and he was already speaking about her belongings as though she had been nothing more than a financial opportunity. Vanessa quietly joined him and reminded me that children normally inherited before grandchildren. She smiled while saying it, almost as if she expected me to congratulate them. Neither of them realized that every greedy word pushed them closer to the humiliation waiting ahead. I answered with nothing more than a calm look before turning away as the chapel bells called everyone back inside. The congregation slowly returned to their seats. A peaceful silence settled across the room as the pastor walked toward the podium. Instead of opening his Bible, he placed a thick sealed envelope on the wooden stand in front of him. I immediately recognized the envelope because Grandma had mentioned it. During our final conversation, Richard noticed it as well, although his reaction was completely different. He straightened his tie and looked almost pleased, probably believing it contained a heartfelt letter, praising him as a devoted son. I lowered my eyes for a moment and silently wished Grandma could somehow witness what was about to happen. The pastor cleared his throat before explaining that Grandma had personally delivered the envelope to her attorney shortly before her medical emergency. She had given clear instructions that its contents must be shared with everyone attending her funeral. Before the service ended, curious whispers spread through the chapel. The pastor carefully broke the seal, unfolded the letter, and began reading in a calm voice. The first few lines thanked everyone for coming and expressed gratitude for the friendships that had filled her long life. Then his tone became more serious. He paused briefly before reading the next paragraph exactly as Grandma had written it. She said that if her son Richard was sitting in the room, he should not pretend to be a grieving son, because he had surrendered that privilege through his own actions. A loud gasp swept across the chapel. I heard people shift in their seats as dozens of surprised eyes turned toward my parents. Richard's confident expression vanished instantly. Vanessa grabbed his arm so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Their carefully rehearsed performance had cracked, but the hardest part was still ahead. The pastor looked toward me and gave a small respectful nod. He explained that Grandma had prepared one final message to accompany her written letter. My heartbeat became louder than everything else around me as I reached into my purse and removed the flash drive she had trusted me with. Walking to the projector felt strangely peaceful because I knew I was simply honoring the promise I had made. I connected the drive, selected the video, and stepped back as the large screen slowly came to life. Grandma's face appeared on the screen exactly as I remembered from that final night in the hospital. She looked weak, but there was an unmistakable strength in her eyes. Every conversation stopped. Every movement inside the chapel disappeared. She calmly greeted everyone before explaining that if they were watching the recording, she had already left this world. Then she spoke directly about Richard. She explained that while she lay in intensive care praying to see her son one final time, Claire had begged him to come before it was too late. Without raising her voice, Grandma held up the phone displaying the text message. The image filled the projector screen for everyone to read. She slowly repeated every word Richard had written, explaining that he would only come if she actually died, because I was already there to take care of everything. Shock spread across the room like a wave. Some relatives covered their mouths while others looked toward my parents in complete disbelief. A neighbor sitting near the back quietly shook his head, unable to hide his disappointment. Grandma continued speaking with remarkable calm. She explained that the text message had not broken her heart because it only confirmed a painful truth she had known for years. She described how appearances could fool people for decades, but character always revealed itself when compassion required sacrifice. She reminded everyone that love was measured by presence, loyalty, and action rather than expensive gifts or emotional speeches delivered after someone was gone. Every sentence carried quiet wisdom instead of bitterness, making her words even more powerful. She then revealed that after receiving that final message, she had immediately contacted her attorney to complete one last update to her estate plan. She smiled gently before saying that her greatest treasure had never been money or property. Her greatest treasure had been discovering who truly stood beside her when she needed them most. Looking directly into the camera, she thanked me for every hospital visit, every shared meal, every repaired fence, every birthday, every conversation over coffee, and every ordinary day we had spent together. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down my face. Then came the moment everyone would remember forever. Grandma officially announced that she was leaving her home, personal savings, family keepsakes, and every meaningful possession to me because I had already proven through my actions that I valued people above wealth. A warm murmur of approval spread through the chapel. Many relatives nodded because they knew how close we had always been. Richard stared at the screen without blinking. The confidence that had filled his face earlier that morning had completely disappeared. Grandma was not finished. She calmly explained that Richard and Vanessa would still receive one piece of property. For the first time since the video began, I saw hope return to their expressions. They glanced at each other as though believing everything had worked out after all. Grandma revealed that the property was an old commercial building downtown, before either of them could celebrate. She continued explaining that the building carried hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid taxes, massive structural repair orders, and overwhelming debt secured against it. Accepting the property also meant accepting every legal and financial obligation attached to it. She looked directly into the camera one final time before delivering the words that echoed through the silent chapel. She said that people who spent their lives chasing wealth without compassion deserved to inherit the weight of their own choices. If they wanted everything she owned, they could also carry everything she had struggled to keep from becoming someone else's burden. It was not revenge. It was responsibility. The screen slowly faded to black, leaving the room completely silent. Nobody moved for several long seconds. The silence finally broke when quiet whispers spread across the chapel. Some relatives looked disappointed, others looked angry. Many simply looked heartbroken because they had never imagined Grandma had endured such loneliness during her final years. Richard suddenly stood up and insisted the recording was unfair. He claimed Grandma had been confused because of medication. Before anyone could respond, the family attorney calmly rose from his seat and explained that every legal document had been signed while multiple witnesses confirmed Grandma's mental competence. There would be no challenge because everything had been completed properly under the law. Richard opened his mouth to argue again, but nobody seemed interested in listening anymore. The same people who had comforted him earlier now stepped away instead of standing beside him. Vanessa lowered her head, avoiding every pair of eyes that met hers. They had spent years protecting an image built on appearances, and it collapsed in less than 10 minutes. Realizing there was nothing left to gain, Richard grabbed Vanessa's hand and hurried toward the exit without saying goodbye to anyone. The heavy chapel doors closed behind them, and neither of them looked back. The atmosphere inside the chapel slowly softened again. The pastor finished the service by speaking about forgiveness, honesty, and the lasting impact one good life could have on countless others. Friends and neighbors shared memories that made everyone laugh through their tears. Instead of leaving with anger in my heart, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. Grandma had not used her final moments to spread hatred. She had simply refused to let lies become the story people remembered. Over the following months, I moved into the beautiful house where so many of my happiest childhood memories had been made. Every room reminded me of Grandma. Her favorite chair still sat beside the living room window. The garden bloomed exactly the way she had planned, and handwritten recipes remained neatly organized inside the kitchen drawer. Instead of turning the house into something new, I preserved the warmth she had created because it felt like keeping a part of her alive. The attorney later confirmed exactly what Grandma had predicted. Richard and Vanessa desperately tried to escape the commercial property, but the debts attached to it could not simply be ignored. They were forced to sell expensive cars, investment accounts, and even the vacation home they loved so much just to satisfy creditors and government penalties. The inheritance they had expected to make them richer became the very thing that destroyed the comfortable lifestyle they had always placed above family. Their greed had finally caught up with them. As for me, I chose a different path. Part of the money Grandma left behind went toward restoring community programs she had supported for years. We donated to local food banks, funded scholarships in her name, and organized volunteer projects that reflected the kindness she had shown throughout her life. Every good deed reminded me that a legacy is not measured by the size of an estate but by the number of lives touched with compassion. I have not spoken to Richard or Vanessa since the funeral. Strangely, I no longer carry the anger that once consumed me. Distance gave me something I had never experienced before: freedom. I stopped waiting for parents who would never become the people I needed them to be. Instead, I focused on building relationships with people who actually valued honesty, loyalty, and love. Grandma spent years teaching me those lessons, and her final gift allowed me to live them without fear. Sometimes I still think about that text message. It arrived as one of the cruelest moments of my life, yet it also became the beginning of my freedom. If my parents had rushed to the hospital pretending to care, the truth might have remained hidden forever. Their own selfishness exposed them more completely than I ever could have. In the end, Grandma did not leave behind revenge. She left behind justice, truth, and a reminder that love is proven by what we choose to do when nobody is forcing us to stay. Whenever I walk through her garden at sunset, I remember the promise I made while holding her hand during those final hours. I promised that her kindness would never be forgotten and that the truth would never be buried beneath comfortable lies. I kept that promise. Her voice reached every person gathered in that chapel, and it continues to guide me every single day. Blood may create relatives, but love creates family, and that is the greatest inheritance anyone could ever receive.